Charles II of Navarre, the king who ate gold. History records many unusual royal deaths, kings slain on the battlefield, poisoned in their sleep, or struck down by conspirators. Some passed quietly, others violently, but few with the theatrical horror that accompanied the final moments of Charles II of Navarre. Among the annals of medieval demise, one death stands out as especially haunting, grotesque, and unforgettable. The fiery end of a king known more for cunning than courage. Known in his lifetime as Charles the Bad, his legacy was already stained by a career of betrayal, shifting loyalties, and the ruthless exercise of political manipulation. He was feared by rivals, espouses, mistrusted by allies, and remembered in court chronicles less for heroism than for plots, poisons, and hidden daggers. But all of this was eclipsed by the terrifying strangeness of his final moments. Burned alive in his bed, wrapped in linen bandages soaked with flammable spirits. His death was so bizarre, so symbolic, that it captured not only the attention of his contemporaries, but remained embedded in Europe's historical imagination for centuries to come. Was it divine punishment, as many in the deeply religious 14th century believed? The just wrath of heaven for a life filled with lies and power plays? Was it a cruel accident, the result of an inattentive servant and a tragic miscalculation? Or, as some speculated at the time, was it something more sinister, perhaps even sabotage, carried out by enemies within his own court? At the heart of this mystery was a singular substance, gold. Not the metal in coin or crown, but in elixir, an alchemical creation that promised to purify, to strengthen, even to bestow a form of immortality. Charles believed in its power. He believed in the idea that alchemy could deliver him from age and illness. He had spent a lifetime trying to outmaneuver death through diplomacy and deceit. Now, he sought to defy it through science. This is the story of Charles II of Navarre, a monarch who gambled everything on survival, a king of endless intrigue, and a man whose search for eternal life ended in a blaze so spectacular it became legend. His is a tale of ambition, fear, and the catastrophic price of placing faith in the unknown. To understand the man and his end, we must first understand his world. The 14th century was a time of fracture, upheaval, and shifting allegiances. Europe was gripped by plague, war, economic instability, and religious uncertainty. The Black Death, which swept through the continent between 1347 and 1351, decimated populations and upended the social fabric. With a third of Europe's population dead, economies collapsed, labor shortages erupted, and long-standing hierarchies began to erode. Nobility and clergy who survived were forced to reckon with a new world shaped by fear and mortality. At the same time, the 100 Years' War between England and France raged on, destabilizing the political order even further. Feudal loyalties were tested, borders were redrawn, and monarchs struggled to assert control over increasingly independent nobles. The war was not only about crowns, it was about the legitimacy of dynasties, the control of trade routes, and the assertion of national identity in an era that lacked modern nation-states. Into this volatile landscape stepped Charles II of Navarre. His kingdom was small, but strategically positioned, straddling the Pyrenees and sitting between major powers like France, England, Castile, and Aragon. It was a land both overlooked and coveted, a space that could serve as a corridor for armies or as a buffer for diplomacy. Charles was born in 1332 to Philip III of Navarre and Joan II, daughter of Louis X of France and queen in her own right. Through her, Charles inherited not only Navarre but valuable territories in Normandy, regions rich in resources and political leverage. These holdings placed him directly in the path of French royal ambitions and allowed him to play a dangerous game of power between rival crowns. Navarre's modest size belied its importance. It served as a hinge point in the grand strategies of Western Europe. Its monarch had to be nimble, decisive, and willing to use whatever leverage he possessed. Charles was all of that, and more. He was not merely shrewd, He was ruthless, calculating, and consumed by a need to remain relevant at any cost. From his youth, Charles honed his skills as a political manipulator. He allied with Edward III of England when it suited him, only to later switch sides and negotiate directly with the French court. He married strategically, deployed spies across courts, and was unafraid to employ assassination as a tool of policy. He became infamous for his involvement in the murder of Charles de Lacerda, the French king's favorite advisor. It was a clear and brutal message. Charles II was not afraid to use violence to protect or expand his influence. His court became synonymous with danger, his name whispered in fear and admiration alike. His use of poison, whether fact or rumor, further elevated his notoriety. Nobles and clerics alike feared inviting him to banquets. His meals were tested, his guards rotated frequently. He projected paranoia and power in equal measure. This aura of menace made him a central, if unstable, player in the great game of European politics. Charles's reputation spread quickly. Chroniclers of the time dubbed him Charles the Bad, not solely for acts of cruelty, but because of the constant threat he represented. He was perceived as a destabilizing force, unpredictable, clever, and utterly self-serving. And yet, in an age defined by duplicity and ambition, he was also begrudgingly admired for his intellect and his ability to outmaneuver more powerful adversaries. But his relentless pursuit of influence came at a cost. The French monarchy, though once tolerant of his maneuvers, grew weary of his manipulations. The English, once hopeful allies, saw him as a liability. By the latter half of his reign, Charles had lost much of his political capital, both domestically and abroad. Yet he never gave up the game. Even as his physical strength waned, he continued plotting, negotiating, and seeking ways to secure his legacy. That enduring hunger for relevance, for power, for control would not only define his reign, but would ultimately shape the strange and tragic way in which he met his end. Charles's most defining trait was his ability to play both sides in the 100 Years' War. While the English and French crowns struggled for dominance, Charles positioned himself as an indispensable ally to both, only to betray them when it suited his goals. His entire political philosophy seemed rooted in fluid allegiance, never fixed, always flexible, always self-serving. In the 1350s, he struck a formal alliance with Edward III of England, offering military and strategic support in return for promises of territory and recognition of his claims. English hopes rested heavily on Charles's ability to rally Norman lords and apply pressure to the French monarchy from within. But Charles had no intention of becoming a mere proxy. Almost as soon as he pledged himself to England, he opened a separate channel of negotiations with the French king, John II. He calculated correctly that the French would offer more land, money, titles if he were willing to turn against his English patrons. Within months, Charles had renegotiated his position with France, gained new estates, and abandoned the English cause. His duplicity was not a secret. Ambassadors wrote of him with exasperation. Chroniclers painted him as a man with no allegiance but to himself. This cycle of alliance and betrayal repeated itself throughout his reign. No matter how many times he was ostracized, Charles returned to the negotiating table with another offer, another threat, another bribe. He was a man who could not be ignored. He was not loyal, but he was useful. But politics were only part of his arsenal. Charles developed a reputation for weaponizing fear and uncertainty. He cultivated an image of danger, not only through military might, but through darker means. Rumors of poison swirled around his court. Some were likely true. The most infamous case was the death of Charles de Lacerda in 1354, the French king's favored constable. De Lacerda was murdered by a group of Navarre's agents, almost certainly on Charles's orders. The killing was brutal and public, its message unmistakable. It shocked the French court and marked a turning point in Charles's campaign to dominate Normandy. With one calculated strike, he removed a powerful rival and destabilized the king's authority. Though the French condemned the act, they also responded by granting Charles further concessions in a desperate attempt to avoid full rebellion. Poisoning became a motif associated with Charles. He was believed to use it to eliminate rivals, coerce nobles, and control outcomes. Though evidence is sparse, the consistency of these accusations across sources suggests at least a partially deserved reputation. His court was a place of shifting alliances, constant surveillance, and persistent fear. Charles trusted no one, not even his closest advisors. He rotated his council regularly, executed suspected traitors without trial, and kept mercenaries close to enforce his will. Meals were prepared under watchful eyes, tasted beforehand, and often discarded altogether. Even within his own chambers, Charles lived like a hunted man. This pervasive paranoia was not entirely irrational. Charles made enemies easily, kings, nobles, even his own subjects. He ruled through dominance, not affection, and his governance style reflected his lack of faith in human loyalty. In his later years, his influence diminished, but his ambitions never waned. As age sapped his strength, his mind remained sharp, calculating, dangerous. He still wrote letters with coded instructions, issued bribes to keep nobles in line, and commissioned plots against political opponents. He could no longer ride to war, but he could still manipulate events from his chamber. And so, when illness eventually struck, Charles turned not to conventional medicine, but to what he believed was the frontier of healing, alchemy. Doctors were not enough for a king who distrusted ordinary men. He sought miraculous restoration through gold, through mystery, through the promise of eternal strength. His body might have weakened, but his belief in control over life, death, and fate itself remained undiminished. It was this belief that would ultimately betray him. In 1387, Charles fell gravely ill. His body, worn by decades of treachery, paranoia, and the physical toll of rule, began to give way. What had once been the frame of a vigorous monarch now showed signs of irreversible decay. His skin grew sallow, his limbs ached, and his energy waned. He was in his mid-50s, an old age for the 14th century, but Charles would not accept the approach of death passively. He believed there had to be a way to fight it, a way to outmaneuver death as he had outmaneuvered rivals. Rather than turn to the standard physicians of his court, Charles turned to those who promised more than medicine. He turned to alchemists. In the world of medieval science, alchemy held a mysterious and potent allure. It promised not just cures, but miracles. Alchemists claimed they could transform base metals into gold, extend life, and cleanse the soul through physical purification. Their language was cryptic, their methods arcane, but their promises were seductive, especially to a king desperate to defy mortality. Among the upper classes, belief in the curative power of gold had become increasingly fashionable. Gold, it was believed, was the purest of all substances, immune to corrosion, symbolically linked to the sun, and untouched by the decay of time. Alchemical philosophy argued that this purity could be transferred to the human body. In liquid form, gold was thought to cleanse the blood, strengthen the heart, and protect against disease. Kings and nobles across Europe experimented with such elixirs, often at great cost and little result. Charles's court physicians, influenced by these ideas and eager to appease their ruler, prepared a potent elixir. The exact formula has not survived, but it likely consisted of powdered gold suspended in strong alcohol, possibly infused with other herbal or mystical ingredients. While many gold tinctures were ingested, in Charles's case, the treatment was meant for external application, a method believed to allow the body to absorb the vitality of gold directly through the skin. The preparation of the king for this ritualistic treatment was elaborate. Servants removed his garments, exposing his frail and possibly ulcerated skin. The golden mixture was carefully rubbed across his limbs and torso with slow, methodical strokes. To enhance the absorption and prevent evaporation, his body was then wrapped tightly in fine linen soaked in alcohol. It may have been wine or a distilled spirit, whatever the substance. It was flammable and dangerously volatile. The procedure was conducted with a reverence bordering on the religious. Every step followed with ceremonial solemnity, guided by a belief that this was more than medicine, it was a transformation, a final alchemical rebirth. The linen wrappings, warm and pungent with alcohol, sealed the elixir against the king's flesh. It was a final, desperate attempt to restore the body and prolong life. Then came the last stage, trimming the wrappings and sealing the treatment. In a poorly lit chamber, the servant responsible for this task made a catastrophic mistake. Perhaps fatigued, perhaps unaware of the danger, he brought an open candle too close. The result was instantaneous. The alcohol-soaked linens ignited with explosive force. Flames raced across Charles's body, enveloping him in seconds. His bed became an inferno. Witnesses described screams that pierced the walls, shrieks of pain from a king who moments earlier had hoped for rebirth. The servants panicked. Some fled, others tried desperately to smother the fire with blankets or water. But the fire had already done its damage. By the time the blaze was subdued, Charles was horrifically burned. His skin charred, muscles exposed, and the stench of scorched flesh filled the room. Physicians could do nothing. He lingered in agony. Hours, perhaps longer, unable to find peace, unable even to speak. Eventually, he died, consumed not by age or disease, but by the very treatment meant to save him. His death was brutal, chaotic, and deeply symbolic, a moment of grotesque irony that would overshadow everything he had done in life. Chroniclers such as Jean Froissart preserve the details, fascinated and horrified by the scene. They saw in it a divine message, the dangers of pride, the folly of tampering with the natural order, and the inescapable justice of fate. The legend spread quickly, of a king who sought immortality through gold, only to die screaming, his body engulfed in the flames of his own ambition. Whether every detail was literal truth or shaped by the dramatic flair of medieval storytelling, the essence remains chillingly real. A monarch, grasping at the secrets of eternal life, became a cautionary tale, a man betrayed not by enemies, but by belief in the impossible. The death of Charles II of Navarre in such horrific fashion sent shockwaves through the region. It was not merely the fact that he died, it was how he died, engulfed in flames, shrieking in agony, the victim of his own alchemical ambitions. In an age where spectacle shaped public memory, this was a spectacle few could forget. His sudden and scandalous demise left his kingdom in disarray. The court, long used to functioning under Charles's domineering rule, found itself paralyzed. Key alliances were left unresolved. Court factions jostled for control in the absence of firm leadership. There were fears of rebellion among the nobility and murmurs that divine punishment had not yet run its course. Into this confusion stepped his son, Charles III, later called Charles the Noble. He inherited more than a crown. He inherited a kingdom tainted by years of duplicity, suspicion, and the long shadow of his father's infamy. The younger Charles recognized immediately the need for transformation. He could not rule as his father had, not with fear, not with poison, not with ever-shifting loyalty. He would have to restore dignity to the throne. Charles III began with reconciliation. He reopened dialogue with the French crown, repaired relations with internal noble houses, and curbed the court's appetite for espionage and purges. He implemented reforms aimed at transparency, consistency, and justice, terms that had been foreign under his father's reign. Over time, his efforts bore fruit. While never a dominant player in continental politics, Navarre under Charles III became stable, respected, and internally cohesive. Internationally, Charles II's death marked the final decline of Navarre's influence in broader European power struggles. In previous decades, the kingdom had played England and France against each other with cunning. But after the fire and the fall of Charles the Bad, Navarre no longer held the political capital to act as a broker. The kingdom retreated from the center of European politics and turned its attention inward, toward consolidation, stability, and reform. Its era of manipulation was over. Yet perhaps the most lasting consequence was not political but symbolic. To many, Charles's death was more than a tragic accident. It was divine judgment. In a deeply religious and superstitious age, the imagery of a king dying in flames resonated profoundly. Clerics across Europe spoke of the fire as God's retribution for decades of deceit, treachery, and arrogance. The symbolism was irresistible. A man who had sought to cheat death through gold and alchemy, punished by the very forces he tried to command. Medieval society, steeped in theological interpretation, viewed such endings as moral lessons. Charles' death became a parable, one told in sermons, in manuscripts, and at royal courts. His downfall was cited as evidence that no human, no matter how powerful, could escape divine justice. The idea that pride precedes destruction was etched into the narrative of his final days. The golden elixir, once a symbol of alchemical brilliance and eternal life, transformed into a cautionary symbol of hubris. What was meant to save him had become the agent of his demise. Alchemists, once courted by kings, now faced heightened skepticism. Some were dismissed, others fled. In the years that followed, references to Charles II of Navarre would often accompany warnings about the dangers of pursuing unnatural power. For Charles, the pursuit of immortality did not end in triumph. It ended in immolation. His death was not merely notable, it was unforgettable. And in that, perhaps, he did achieve a form of immortality, though not the kind he had hoped for. Charles II's death would outlive his reign. For generations, the story was retold with variations, but always with the same core: a king consumed by his own ambition, punished by fire. It became a staple of medieval lore, told in royal courts, village taverns, and cloisters alike. The story evolved into something larger than a chronicle, a morality tale, a parable illustrating the dangers of hubris. Artists illustrated it, clergy cited it in sermons, teachers passed it to their pupils. In every retelling, Charles was not just a monarch, he was a warning. As time went on, the legend merged with broader themes of human overreach. Charles was grouped with mythical figures like Icarus, men who tried to transcend natural limits and paid the ultimate price. His fate, death by the very method meant to preserve him, was too poetic, too symbolic to ignore. Even when softened by time, the narrative retained its moral weight. Do not place yourself above nature, or the divine will rectify your arrogance. In the broader history of alchemy, Charles's death served as an emblematic caution. Alchemy would continue to thrive for centuries through the courts of Renaissance princes and within the secretive laboratories of early scientists, but the specter of failure always lingered. The accidents, the fires, the mental breakdowns of those who sought too much too quickly, these were not isolated cases. Charles became, in retrospect, one of the earliest public faces of the risks inherent in pseudoscientific experimentation. While some still admired alchemy for its philosophical insights and practical offshoots, others pointed to Charles as a victim of blind faith in an unproven art. His death did not halt alchemical inquiry, but it introduced a note of caution into its pursuit. Writers began referencing him in tracts warning of recklessness. His name became shorthand for the hazards of ambition untethered from evidence. Navarre would go on, but never again would one of its monarchs hold the sway or notoriety of Charles the Bad. His successors ruled with more moderation, more diplomacy, but less consequence. Charles's reputation, though infamous, gave him a kind of stature that outlasted his lineage. His deeds, both real and exaggerated, became more studied than his reforms. Even centuries later, his name would evoke images of fire, gold, and folly. In academic circles, modern historians approach the accounts with a more tempered eye. Froissart's vivid descriptions, while invaluable, are colored by the narrative tendencies of medieval chroniclers, writers who blended reportage with entertainment and moralism. Nevertheless, the core facts are difficult to dispute. Charles did experiment with alchemical remedies. Alcohol played a role. A fire occurred. The king, in agony, perished. Even if the precise sequence of events was dramatized, the outcome remains chillingly factual. The truth, stripped of fable, is still astonishing. That a king would seek to escape mortality through mysticism only to perish by its hand offers a story as compelling now as it was 6 centuries ago. It is not merely a tale of a death, it is a lens into a worldview where science, faith, and desperation collided. And it reminds us that even those who sit atop thrones are vulnerable to the same frailties, fears, and fatal mistakes as the humblest of their subjects. In the end, the story of Charles II of Navarre is one of contradictions, grand and petty, political and personal, mortal and symbolic. A brilliant strategist undone by overreach who knew how to manipulate kings but not his own fate. A cunning politician laid low not by a rival's sword, but by the frailty of his own body and the miscalculation of a servant. A ruler obsessed with life extension who ended up embodying one of the most cautionary deaths in royal history. The 14th century was an age of belief not just in divine right, but in mystery, in omens, in the power of relics, in the idea that gold, the incorruptible metal, could purify the soul and fortify the flesh. Charles II did not simply dabble in these ideas. He embraced them with the desperation of a man who had seen too many plots and lived too many close calls. He had survived betrayal, war, and diplomatic isolation. Why not survive time itself? He placed his trust in alchemy not as a curiosity, but as a solution. He believed in it as his salvation. But it became his doom. His death in flames is remembered not just because of its horror, but because of its bitter irony, because it turned a final attempt at control into an emblem of chaos. The fatal intersection of ambition, superstition, and the limits of the human body played out not in myth, but in fact. History judges Charles the Bad not solely by what he did in life, though his record is ample. He is judged just as much by how he left the world, in agony, in fire, undone by the same arrogance that had defined his reign. And perhaps that is the final irony. For all his attempts to shape Europe through treaties and daggers, to rewrite his story with gold and mystery, it was a candle, humble, flickering, and thoughtlessly handled, that wrote the last line of his legend. Not a weapon of state, but a tool of light, made him immortal in the one way he never intended. Henry VIII, tyrant of 6 wives. Few monarchs in European history have left as lasting a mark as Henry VIII of England. His name alone evokes an unmistakable image, a broad-shouldered king, cloaked in furs and jewels, eyes sharp with authority, surrounded by courtiers and intrigue. But beyond the theatrical portraits lies a man whose personal insecurities and political ambitions reshaped not only his kingdom, but the very nature of monarchy in England. Henry VIII had 6 wives. 2 were executed by his command. 2 were cast aside with the stroke of a pen. 1 died in childbirth, and 1 alone survived him. These numbers, often recited as trivia, conceal a much deeper story. A story of dynastic pressure, patriarchal obsession, and political revolution. Behind the facade of divine rule, Henry's reign was marked by doubt, desire, and the relentless pursuit of a male heir. But the tragedy of Henry's reign is not limited to the fates of his wives. His personal turmoil unleashed forces that would rip through England's religious and political fabric. The rupture with the Roman Catholic Church, the creation of a new state religion, and the centralization of royal power were not carefully calculated reforms. They were desperate responses to an internal crisis. A family drama became a national upheaval, and the consequences still echo in British life today. This is the story of how the private life of a king transformed a nation. How one man's relentless pursuit of legacy turned into one of the most consequential reigns in English history. A cautionary tale, a political revolution, and a personal tragedy, all rolled into one reign. To understand Henry, we must first understand the world he inherited. England at the turn of the 16th century was a relatively modest kingdom by European standards. It was not the vast empire it would become under later monarchs. Instead, it was a semi-feudal society where power was still decentralized and loyalty to the Church of Rome was both spiritual and political. Henry VII, Henry VIII's father, had come to the throne through conquest. His victory over Richard III at Bosworth Field in 1485 ended decades of dynastic warfare, the Wars of the Roses, and established the Tudor dynasty. But the claim was shaky. Henry VII spent much of his reign solidifying his legitimacy, marrying Elizabeth of York to unite the warring houses and eliminating rival claimants. The court of Henry VII was cautious, austere, and focused on security. By contrast, Henry VIII's court would become extravagant, competitive, and filled with ambition. Henry VIII inherited a stable kingdom, but not a strong one. The structures of government were inefficient. Nobles still wielded considerable independent power. The church, wealthy, deeply entrenched, and loyal to Rome, commanded enormous influence. Henry was the second son of the king. His older brother Arthur, Prince of Wales, was the heir and had been groomed from birth for kingship. In 1501, Arthur was married to Catherine of Aragon, a Spanish princess whose parents, Ferdinand and Isabella, were among the most powerful monarchs in Christendom. But Arthur died only months after the marriage, reportedly from illness. This unexpected death changed Henry's life forever. Suddenly, the boy who was destined for a life in the church became the heir to the throne. The path of kingship was laid before him, and with it, the expectation to continue the Tudor legacy. In 1509, at just 17 years old, Henry became King of England. He married Catherine of Aragon soon after, an arrangement that required a papal dispensation since she had been his brother's widow. The young couple was well matched in many ways. Catherine was learned, deeply religious, and politically astute. Henry was athletic, charismatic, and eager to prove himself as a powerful monarch. In these early years, Henry cultivated the image of a Renaissance prince. He was educated in classical languages, music, theology, and philosophy. He jousted, hunted, and played the lute. He wrote poetry. He invited humanists like Erasmus and Thomas More to court. England, under Henry's youthful enthusiasm, seemed poised to join the cultural rebirth sweeping Europe. But beneath the promise of his early reign, a tension was beginning to grow, one rooted in the expectations of kingship. More than anything else, Henry was expected to produce a male heir. At the time, the English crown did not operate under strict rules of male-only succession. A woman could inherit the throne, but it was considered dangerous. The chaos of civil war that followed the reign of earlier female claimants was fresh in the minds of many nobles. A male heir was not just preferable. It was, in the minds of the Tudor court, essential. The early years of Henry and Catherine's marriage were filled with personal sorrow. Catherine experienced numerous pregnancies, but most ended in miscarriage or stillbirth. Only one child, a daughter named Mary, born in 1516, survived infancy. As Catherine aged, the likelihood of bearing another child diminished. This was no ordinary marital problem. In a dynastic monarchy, the question of succession was a matter of national security. Henry's failure to produce a male heir was not only a personal disappointment, it was perceived as a looming crisis for the stability of the realm. By the 1520s, Henry's anxieties had become obsessions. As the prospect of a male heir with Catherine grew dim, his thoughts turned toward a solution that would shock Christendom and alter the course of English history. As the 1520s dawned, Henry VIII was still without a male heir, and the tension this caused at court was growing palpable. England's dynastic memory was scarred by the Wars of the Roses, a series of brutal conflicts rooted in questions of succession. Henry feared that unless a legitimate son succeeded him, his fragile Tudor lineage could unravel. Catherine of Aragon, now in her late 30s, had suffered multiple miscarriages and stillbirths. Each loss was not only a personal blow but a political crisis. Foreign ambassadors reported on her health and her fertility. Diplomats gossiped about the king's mood. Henry began to view his marriage not just as unfruitful, but as cursed. This belief found fuel in Scripture. In the book of Leviticus, chapter 20, verse 21, Henry read, "If a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. They shall be childless." Although his marriage to Catherine had been sanctioned by Pope Julius II, Henry came to see it as invalid in God's eyes, or at least this is the rationale he presented publicly. Privately, another force was at work, Anne Boleyn. Anne was the daughter of Sir Thomas Boleyn, a prominent courtier and diplomat. She had spent part of her youth at the courts of Margaret of Austria in the Netherlands and Queen Claude in France. These experiences had shaped her into a woman of sharp intellect and courtly sophistication. She returned to England in her early 20s and entered the service of Queen Catherine as a lady-in-waiting. Unlike her sister Mary, who had previously been Henry's mistress, Anne would not yield to the king's advances. Her refusal both enraged and enthralled Henry. He began to court her with gifts, letters, and promises. Anne made it clear that she would not be his mistress, only his wife. If Henry wanted her, he would have to annul his marriage to Catherine. By 1527, Henry had resolved to pursue an annulment. He appealed to Pope Clement VII, claiming that his marriage had never been lawful. The political climate, however, was not in his favor. The Pope was effectively a prisoner of Emperor Charles V, Catherine's nephew, whose troops had recently sacked Rome. Clement stalled. He could not alienate Charles V, nor did he want to set a precedent for overruling a papal dispensation. For 6 years, the matter dragged on. Henry grew increasingly impatient. The Queen's supporters within the court, such as Bishop John Fisher and Sir Thomas More, opposed the annulment. But Anne Boleyn had powerful allies too, including Thomas Cromwell and Thomas Cranmer, men whose reformist ideas would shape the new Church of England. Henry's failure to secure an annulment through Rome marked a turning point. No longer willing to wait for papal permission, he began to consider a more radical solution: to remove the Pope's authority from England altogether. This was no mere divorce. It was a declaration of sovereignty, a break with centuries of tradition and spiritual allegiance. The personal had become political, and Henry was prepared to challenge the authority of the Church itself to resolve his dynastic dilemma. The decision to sever ties with Rome did not come all at once. It was the culmination of years of frustration, maneuvering, and ideological transformation. Henry was aided by a rising class of administrators and thinkers, men like Cromwell and Cranmer, who saw an opportunity to centralize power, reform religious practice, and enrich the crown. In 1532, Archbishop William Warham died, and Henry appointed Thomas Cranmer to succeed him. Cranmer, a theologian sympathetic to reformist ideas, was a loyal servant to the king's cause. The following year, Anne Boleyn became pregnant. This accelerated the urgency of Henry's plan. If the child was a boy, he needed the birth to be legitimate in the eyes of English law. In January 1533, Henry and Anne were secretly married. In May, Cranmer convened a special court which declared Henry's marriage to Catherine null and void. Anne was crowned queen at Westminster Abbey in June, and later that year she gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth. Henry's expectations had not been met. He had hoped for a son. But the break with Rome had already begun. Parliament passed a series of acts that formalized the new order. The Act in Restraint of Appeals, 1533, prohibited subjects from appealing to the Pope in Rome, asserting that the King of England had full jurisdiction over his realm. The Act of Supremacy, 1534, declared Henry the only supreme head on earth of the Church of England. These changes were monumental. The Pope's authority was abolished, monasteries were scrutinized, clergy were forced to swear loyalty to the king, opposition was met with imprisonment, exile, or execution. One of the most prominent victims was Sir Thomas More, Henry's former Lord Chancellor and a devout Catholic. More refused to swear the oath of supremacy. In 1535, he was executed for treason. His death sent a clear message: dissent would not be tolerated. Despite all Henry's sacrifices, Anne failed to produce a male heir. She suffered several miscarriages, including one believed to have been a boy. Her influence at court began to wane. Political enemies, including Henry's chief minister Thomas Cromwell, began to conspire against her. In May 1536, Anne was arrested on charges of adultery, incest, and treason. The charges were almost certainly fabricated. Nonetheless, Anne was convicted and sentenced to death. On May 19th, she was beheaded by a French swordsman. a rare form of execution meant to be more merciful than the axe. 11 days later, Henry married Jane Seymour. The woman who had changed the course of English history was gone. Her daughter, Elizabeth, was declared illegitimate. The king's great gamble had yet to deliver the one thing he most desired, a son. With Anne Boleyn gone and Jane Seymour now queen, Henry appeared briefly satisfied. In 1537, Jane gave birth to a long-awaited son, Edward. The event was celebrated throughout England. Bonfires were lit, bells rang across parishes. Henry finally had his heir. But the triumph was short-lived. Jane died of postnatal complications just days later. Henry was devastated. Of all his wives, Jane would be the only one buried beside him. Edward's birth marked a turning point not only personally, but politically. With his succession seemingly secured, Henry focused his attention on enforcing the new religious order and tightening control over both the church and the nobility. The machinery of the Tudor state grew more aggressive. One of the most dramatic consequences of Henry's break with Rome was the dissolution of the monasteries. A campaign launched between 1536 and 1541 to dismantle hundreds of monastic institutions across England and Wales. Monasteries had long been central to community life. They provided education, charity, medical care, and spiritual guidance. Many had existed since the Norman conquest or earlier. Henry, however, now regarded these institutions as threats, both to his authority and to the wealth of the crown. The crown, facing financial strain, saw monastic wealth as a source of quick revenue. Under the supervision of Thomas Cromwell, royal commissioners were dispatched to inspect religious houses, often citing corruption, idleness, or immorality as justification for closure. In reality, many monasteries were well run, but the policy was systematic. Lands were seized, artifacts and manuscripts were destroyed or sold, lead roofs were stripped, entire abbeys were dismantled, and their materials repurposed. The spiritual and social infrastructure of England was torn up in a matter of years. The impact on the rural poor was profound. Monastic charity had been a major safety net. Its removal exacerbated poverty and social instability, leading to rising vagrancy and crime. Even loyal Catholics who had accepted Henry's religious authority were dismayed by the destruction. The most serious backlash came in 1536 in the north of England. Tens of thousands rose in rebellion during an event known as the Pilgrimage of Grace. Protesters demanded the restoration of the monasteries and the dismissal of Cromwell. They claimed loyalty to Henry but denounced his advisors. Initially, the king promised pardons and reforms, but when order was restored, he broke his promises. Rebel leaders were hunted down and executed. This event cemented Henry's shift toward authoritarianism. He had once ruled with consensus, but now ruled by decree. Parliament became a rubber stamp. Ministers and nobles lived in fear. Even trusted advisors were not safe. In 1540, Thomas Cromwell, who had engineered Anne Boleyn's downfall and masterminded the break from Rome, fell from favor and was executed. His enemies at court, including members of the conservative faction, seized the moment. Yet Henry's authority remained largely intact. Despite the turmoil, he maintained legitimacy in the eyes of many. His reign saw the standardization of English law, the strengthening of central government, and the assertion of England as a sovereign religious state. He negotiated with European powers not as a subordinate monarch, but as an equal. Diplomatically, he played France and the Holy Roman Empire against each other, maintaining England's independence. Henry's death marked the end of a reign that had reshaped the English state. But it was only the beginning of the Tudor religious drama. His son, Edward VI, succeeded him at just 9 years old. Real power rested in the hands of regents, first Edward Seymour, then John Dudley, who pursued aggressive Protestant reforms. Church services were conducted in English, priestly celibacy was abolished, Catholic rituals were stripped away. But Edward's reign was short. He died in 1553, prompting a succession crisis. Henry's will had excluded his great-niece, Lady Jane Grey, from the line, yet she was placed on the throne by Protestant nobles. Her reign lasted 9 days. Mary I, Henry's daughter by Catherine of Aragon, then seized the crown. A devout Catholic, she reversed Edward's reforms, restored papal authority, and persecuted Protestants. Her 5-year reign saw the execution of nearly 300 dissenters, earning her the nickname Bloody Mary. But Mary failed to produce an heir. Upon her death in 1558, the throne passed to Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn. Elizabeth I would become one of England's most iconic monarchs. Her long reign stabilized the religious landscape, establishing the Church of England as a distinctly Protestant institution, though with some compromise in ritual and hierarchy. She never married, and her image as the Virgin Queen stood in deliberate contrast to her father's marital excesses. The legacy of Henry VIII is therefore one of paradox. He was a tyrant and a visionary, a ruler whose personal failings drove national transformation. He centralized power, yet his dynasty teetered on fragile succession. He destroyed the monasteries, but laid the foundations for modern statecraft. His break from Rome inspired a permanent shift toward national sovereignty and secular governance. He is remembered in popular imagination through his wives, a grim roll call of betrayal, execution, and survival. But to historians, Henry's true legacy lies in the institutions he reshaped: the monarchy, the church, and the state. He didn't build England's empire, nor conquer great territories, but he redefined English identity, politically, spiritually, and culturally. Henry VIII's reign offers a singular example of how personal crises can erupt into national transformation. His desire for a male heir set into motion the English Reformation, which dismantled 1,000 years of religious continuity. The monasteries, long the backbone of England's spiritual and social services, were obliterated. The Pope, once a figure of unchallenged authority, was cast out of English life. Parliament, once advisory, became a tool of royal supremacy, but also a foundation for later resistance to tyranny. And at the center of it all stood Henry. Self-assured, unpredictable, and ultimately alone. His obsession with control cost him trusted friends, loyal servants, and ultimately the love of his people. Though he died with an heir, the dynasty he had sacrificed so much to preserve would end just 1 generation later. Yet the echoes of his rule endure. The Church of England remains. The crown, though transformed, still draws authority from the foundations Henry laid. His daughter, Elizabeth I, would become the sovereign he never quite managed to be: wise, tempered, and enduring. In the grand tapestry of history, Henry VIII is not just a king remembered for his wives. He is the king who remade his country in the image of his crisis, a ruler who turned his personal tragedy into the scaffolding of a nation's future. This was the story of Henry VIII, a family tragedy on a national scale. Al-Mu'tamid of Seville, poisoned by mercury. Why did a sultan who ruled with poetry and the sword choose to drink poison with his own hand? And how did his search for eternal youth push him into madness? History tells many stories of kings and sultans, some remembered for their victories, some for their art and learning, and some for their cruelty. But once in a while, there appears a ruler whose death is more shocking than anything he achieved in life. Al-Mu'tamid of Seville was one of these men. He tried to defeat time itself, and it destroyed him. In 11th century Al-Andalus, a land of silk, poetry, and endless battles, Al-Mu'tamid shone brightly. He was praised as a poet king, a clever ruler, and a patron of one of the richest courts in medieval Spain. Yet, even in all his luxury and power, he feared growing old. The passing years, the weakness that comes with age, these were enemies he could never beat in war. Hoping to escape them, he turned to alchemists and their potions. He began to drink mercury mixtures, believing they would cleanse his blood and keep him young. But instead of healing him, they poisoned him. As his mind and body failed, Al-Mu'tamid fell into madness and pain. In the end, he died not surrounded by poems and glory, but broken by the very cure he had trusted. This is the story of Al-Mu'tamid, the Sultan of Seville who drank mercury to stay young and whose tragic fate became a warning about pride, superstition, and the danger of trying to break nature's laws. To understand al-Mu'tamid, one must first step into the dazzling yet turbulent world of 11th century Al-Andalus. Moorish Spain, a land of shifting alliances, rival petty kingdoms, and cultural flowering, stood as one of the jewels of the medieval Mediterranean. After the collapse of the centralized Umayyad Caliphate of Córdoba earlier in the century, Al-Andalus fragmented into the taifas, small independent Muslim-ruled principalities. Seville, under the Abbadid dynasty, rose to become one of the most powerful of these. Its location on the Guadalquivir River, its wealth from trade, and its traditions of scholarship and art made it a rival to any great city of its time. Into this stage stepped Abad III al-Mu'tamid, born in 1040, inheriting the throne from his father in 1069. From the beginning, al-Mu'tamid was a ruler of remarkable contrasts. He was a poet of deep sensitivity, penning verses that still survive today, filled with longing, imagery of gardens, lovers, and the desert winds. Yet he was also a shrewd military commander and a sometimes ruthless politician. His reign took place against the backdrop of Christian kingdoms in the north, growing ever more aggressive in their attempts to reconquer the Iberian Peninsula. Castile, Leon, and Aragon were expanding, seizing Muslim territory wherever they could. Al-Mu'tamid's Seville, though powerful, was constantly threatened by these neighbors and by rival Muslim taifas jealous of Seville's prosperity. Despite the threats, al-Mu'tamid built Seville into a brilliant court of culture. Musicians, poets, philosophers, mathematicians, and architects were drawn to his capital. His love of verse was legendary. He surrounded himself with fellow poets and scholars, often rewarding them generously. This image of refinement and artistic brilliance still colors his memory among historians. Yet, there was a darker current beneath the splendor. Al-Mu'tamid was known for impulsive decisions and a passionate temperament. He was not immune to superstitions, and he was fascinated by alchemy and the supposed science of balancing the humors of the body. Like many of his age, he believed diseases, aging, and even mood were linked to imbalances in the blood and bodily fluids. Physicians and alchemists offered tinctures to restore this balance, and mercury was among the most potent and dangerous of these supposed cures. As the years of al-Mu'tamid's reign passed, the pressures around him grew more acute. To the north, the Christian kingdoms, emboldened and better organized, were gathering their strength. Alfonso VI of Leon and Castile, a monarch of exceptional ambition, had unified his realms and turned them toward conquest. In 1085, the shock came. Toledo, once a dazzling jewel of Muslim Spain, fell to Alfonso. Its capture was a thunderclap that echoed through every court of Al-Andalus, shaking faith in the region's future. For centuries, Muslims had dominated the Iberian Peninsula, projecting confidence and splendor. Toledo's fall broke that illusion. It showed that Christian armies could now penetrate deep into Muslim lands, and that no city, however proud or wealthy, was truly safe. In Seville, the news landed like a hammer. Al-Mu'tamid, whose own armies had for decades managed to fend off both Christian incursions and Muslim rivals, suddenly faced a dilemma of overwhelming proportions. He had watched the Taifa kingdoms fracture and feud for years, but he had never seen a threat this grave, this close. His neighbors, the rival Taifas, sensed weakness. Rulers who had once feared Seville's armies now circled like vultures, calculating how to profit from the Sultan's distress. Diplomats who arrived to speak of alliances left with whispered reports of Seville's vulnerability. In the city itself, anxiety infected every layer of society. In the markets, merchants worried for their caravans, wondering if trade routes might collapse if war swept south. In the mosques and madrasas, scholars debated whether God had withdrawn his blessing from Al-Andalus, whether the time of Muslim supremacy had passed. Rumors grew wild that Alfonso was preparing an unstoppable army, that treachery stalked the Sultan's court, that powerful nobles were plotting to defect to the Christian side. Al-Mutamid, already a man of sensitive temperament, felt these fears acutely. He had built Seville into a glittering capital, famous for its poetry and refinement, its intellectual salons, its musicians and architects. The collapse of Toledo was not merely a political threat to him, it was a threat to the entire idea of what he had tried to build. At this moment of crisis, Al-Mutamid began to face another enemy, the slow, relentless approach of his own aging. He was entering his mid-40s, a respectable age in an era where life expectancy was far lower. Yet to a ruler, especially one whose authority depended on vigor and presence, the signs of decline were terrifying. He noticed a stiffness in his stride, a subtle trembling in his hands, a fatigue that would cling to him even after a night's rest. His poetic spirit, that gift which had so enthralled the scholars of Seville, remained sharp, but his body no longer obeyed him with the same ease. For a man who had been celebrated not only as a patron of the arts, but as a warrior, it felt catastrophic. The court, ever watchful, began to notice as well. Eyes followed him as he walked, scanning for weakness, for hesitation. Rivals within his own palace saw opportunity if the Sultan's strength faltered. Even loyal advisors worried that a single moment of perceived frailty could unravel alliances and provoke rebellion. In response, Al-Mutamid redoubled his efforts to project power. He commissioned new buildings with soaring arches and intricate tiles, monuments meant to proclaim his continued vigor and command. He organized elaborate poetry competitions, summoning famous poets to challenge him in verse, to demonstrate that his mind was as brilliant as ever. He surrounded himself with the most luxurious silks, perfumes, and precious stones, as if to armor himself against the decay of time. Yet, deep inside, he knew these displays could not hold back the erosion of age. He lay awake at night, haunted by dreams of impotence and defeat, seeing Christian knights riding unchallenged through Seville's gates. Sensing this vulnerability, his circle of advisors turned to medicine. In the medieval world, medicine was a strange blend of what we would now call science, magic, and theology. The best-trained physicians were grounded in Galenic theory of the four humors, believing that disease arose from imbalances in blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Alongside them were herbalists steeped in traditional folk cures and alchemists who searched for universal elixirs of youth. It was a world of hopeful experimentation where saffron-infused broths, crushed emeralds, and rare resins from distant lands all promised miraculous cures. In Seville, the brightest minds of the day debated these remedies, eager to please their sultan and to secure his patronage. Among these substances, one stood apart for its strange reputation: mercury, or quicksilver. Since antiquity, this shimmering liquid metal had fascinated healers and philosophers alike. Its fluid, elusive nature was thought to echo the transformative mysteries of life itself. To the medieval mind, something so bright, so metallic, so hard to grasp, surely possessed divine properties. Mercury was praised in certain treatises as a purifier of the blood, a balancer of the humors, a substance so potent that only the strongest could tolerate its harsh powers. In the markets of Seville, apothecaries displayed small vials of mercury like precious jewels, claiming it could drive away melancholy, sharpen the senses, and prolong youth. For a ruler confronting the twin terrors of advancing enemies and his own decline, the appeal was irresistible. Al-Mutamid's healers, men of learning but also of ambition, made confident promises. They invoked respected authorities from Greek and Arab medicine, assuring the Sultan that, with the right preparation, mercury could cleanse his humors and restore his strength. They showed him rituals for mixing the tinctures with herbs to soften the poison, recited prayers over the brew, and cited verses from classical texts to cloak their treatment in scholarly legitimacy. Al-Mutamid was deeply moved by these assurances. He wanted to believe that science and divine will could be combined, that this elixir might preserve the gifts God had granted him, his mind, his charisma, his poetic soul. He wanted to believe that there was a way to keep death and weakness at bay, to keep ruling, to keep inspiring, to keep creating. Around him, the empire trembled on the brink. Christian raids advanced ever closer, tribute payments were growing impossible, and unrest festered in distant towns. Every day, fresh reports arrived of skirmishes on the frontiers, of mercenaries defecting, of allies turning against him. The Sultan's dread of failure, of seeing his city's greatness undone, only deepened. In this haze of fear, an old man's trembling became more than a symptom. It became a symbol of Seville's vulnerability. Al-Mutamid could not accept that symbol. He decided to drink the mercury tincture. It was, to him, an act of hope and an act of desperation. Convinced that the physicians had the knowledge to harness this powerful metal, he placed his trust in them without reserve. He had fought Christian knights and rival taifas with the sword. Now he would fight age and death with quicksilver. And so began the fatal experiment. A powerful ruler, convinced of his destiny, swallowing an elixir that would lead not to renewal, but to ruin. The first doses were taken in secret in the hushed chambers of the Alcazar of Seville. Al-Mutamid trusted only a small circle of physicians and a handful of loyal confidants with knowledge of the treatment. He feared that the rest of his court, ever ready to seize upon any rumor of weakness, might see these potions as proof of decline rather than a path to rebirth. The potion itself was a strange blend. Mercury, quicksilver, was carefully measured and dissolved with bitter herbs, honey, and other infusions designed to soften its deadly power. Each cup was prepared with a ritual solemnity, overseen by the best-trained healers of his realm. They recited prayers from the Quran, evoked the names of great physicians from Persia and Greece, and described the treatment as a gift of divine science. To the Sultan, the ceremonial trappings offered reassurance. He needed to believe that he was not simply ingesting poison, but participating in a healing rite worthy of a king. The brilliant, liquid shimmer of the mercury seemed almost magical, a mirror to the moonlight that flooded his chamber. At first, Al-Mutamid experienced what seemed like a miracle. The metallic taste burned down his throat, but with it came a sudden flush of heat, a tingling along his arms, a lightness in his chest. He described it later to his physicians as a powerful awakening, as if years had fallen away in the space of a heartbeat. His mood lifted, his voice rang clearer in the halls, and he moved with a renewed confidence. Within days, word began to spread among his household. Courtiers whispered that the Sultan was restored, that his strength had returned, that Seville might yet stand against the gathering Christian tide. Optimism stirred, however briefly, among his closest advisers. But the human body is not so easily fooled. Within a few days, the tremors returned, sharper, more pronounced. Al-Mutamid's hands began to shake, spoiling the graceful calligraphy of his poems. Headaches crashed over him like storms, leaving him curled in agony on his cushions, unable to concentrate or issue orders. His eyesight wavered, blurring without warning, and even the simplest tasks became a struggle. His mood darkened. Servants began to notice him pacing at night, reciting verses to himself in a broken, unsteady voice, cursing unseen conspirators in the shadows. Sleep came only in snatches, punctuated by night terrors of advancing Christian horsemen, of poisoners in the palace kitchens, of betrayal at every turn. The physicians, alarmed by these signs, tried to cut the dosage, urging caution. But mercury is a ruthless substance. It does not leave the bloodstream quietly, and even small amounts over time corrode the body from within. As the days turned to weeks, its poison accumulated in Al-Mutamid's tissues, attacking his nerves, his kidneys, and above all, his mind. Soon the Sultan could no longer steady his pen to compose verse. His once famous poetry, so admired across Al-Andalus, turned to meaningless scrawls, phrases that no longer made sense even to himself. When he tried to recite aloud, his voice would break, dissolving into muttered fragments. The loss of his poetry wounded him more deeply than any enemy blade ever could. It was his identity, the part of him that had made him a legend. Watching it slip away drove him further into a spiral of fear and anger. His dreams grew confused and violent. Some nights he believed he was a child again, running through the gardens of Seville with his father, carefree and invincible. Other nights he raged and screamed, convinced that traitors had invaded the palace, that his sons had turned against him, that assassins lurked behind every carved door. The palace was paralyzed by fear. Servants scurried to obey contradictory commands. Ministers tried to keep order, but Al-Mutamid's outbursts were unpredictable. One night, he ordered his guards to seize and execute his personal physician, accusing him of plotting to overthrow him with poisoned remedies. The terrified doctor tried to protest that the mercury had been the Sultan's own decision, but he was dragged away and put to death. Others among the medical staff fled the court altogether, fearing for their lives. Seville's government began to fracture under this chaos. Without a stable hand on the throne, rival factions within the palace competed for control. Advisors who had once cooperated turned against each other, each seeking to place their own candidate on the throne. In the countryside, local governors refused orders or demanded new concessions, sensing weakness. Christian forces to the north observed these developments with great satisfaction. Alfonso VI's agents reported back that Seville was leaderless and trembling. The city that had once seemed invincible was now ruled by a half-mad sovereign, unable to command even his own household. Al-Mutamid's sons tried to intervene. They begged their father to abandon the mercury, to allow other treatments, or simply to rest. But he refused. In rare lucid moments, he still believed that the agony was a sign that the medicine was working, that the poison was purging him of age itself. He was convinced that if he only endured a little longer, the quicksilver would heal him. In truth, the mercury was killing him cell by cell. His mind, once a luminous jewel of Andalusian culture, was collapsing into darkness. Then came the final act. In a fit of panic and despair, Al-Mutamid demanded a greater dose of the tincture, determined to break through what he saw as a healing crisis. His surviving physicians pleaded with him to stop, but he refused. He ordered them to prepare the cup at once. The potion burned him from the inside as he swallowed it, searing its way through his gut, overwhelming his failing organs. Within hours, he was in violent convulsions. Witnesses described a horrifying scene. The Sultan writhing on the cool tiled floors of his palace, foam at his mouth, eyes rolling back, his limbs jerking as if in battle with invisible enemies. He tried to shout orders even then, telling guards to seize conspirators, to defend the walls, to protect Seville. But his words were tangled nonsense, lost in a torrent of spasms. His family stood helplessly by as their father, the poet king, was destroyed by the very cure he had trusted to save him. By dawn, Al-Mutamid was dead. The great patron of poets, the protector of scholars, the sultan who had dreamed of eternal youth, lay silent, claimed by the shimmering poison he had so fervently believed in. The death of Al-Mutamid sent a shock through Seville that could not be contained. Its court had been held together, however imperfectly, by the force of his personality. Once that force collapsed, a vacuum opened instantly. Within days of his final convulsions, rival factions in the palace began to clash. Ministers loyal to Al-Mutamid's sons tried to rally the guard, while other noblemen schemed to install puppet rulers who might appease the Christian kingdoms. The power that had once radiated so confidently from the Sultan's throne fractured overnight. As word of Al-Mutamid's death reached the countryside, rival taifas moved swiftly to probe Seville's weakness. Mercenary captains began to plunder outlying territories. Taxes that had once been paid in gold to Seville's treasuries were withheld or stolen outright. Alfonso VI of Castile saw his chance. With Toledo already under his command, he shifted his gaze southward. In 1086, only a year after Al-Mutamid's death, Christian forces pressed deeper into the heart of Al-Andalus. The once mighty Seville, weakened by its own self-inflicted wound, was unable to mount a unified defense. Al-Mutamid's sons, lacking their father's authority, could not hold the city together. Their legitimacy was fragile, built on the same dynasty that had just seen its sultan die in a haze of madness. As Seville's people saw mercenaries seizing villages and Christian knights demanding tribute, confidence in the abbated line crumbled. The psychological blow was devastating. A ruler whom many had once called the most refined and brilliant of the taifas had ended in an undignified, almost humiliating death. It felt to many like a curse, a sign that Seville had lost divine favor. By 1091, Seville fell to the Almoravids, a Berber dynasty from North Africa who had crossed into Iberia as supposed allies against Christian advances. The Almoravids did not preserve al-Mutamid's legacy. They crushed it. They took his sons captive, dismantled the Abbadid court, and imposed a new order based on their own strict interpretation of Islamic orthodoxy. The dazzling court of poetry, architecture, and music that al-Mutamid had built, a court that had rivaled Baghdad in its day, was extinguished almost overnight. In the popular imagination of Seville, the Sultan's final days became the subject of rumor, of half-truths, of legend. Some claimed he had been cursed by an evil star. Others whispered that he had been bewitched. Many more believed it was divine punishment for arrogance and hubris, for seeking to overturn the order of nature by drinking a deadly poison in search of eternal youth. No matter how the story was told, the reality was inescapable. Seville had lost its greatest patron, and with him, its chance to stand as a beacon of Moorish culture in medieval Iberia. The death of al-Mutamid was more than the death of a man. It was the death of an idea, that poetry, art, and human brilliance alone could shield a kingdom against the brutal realities of politics, war, and time. Centuries have passed since the banners of Seville fell. Al-Mutamid's palace is long gone, and the fragile verses of his court poets have survived only in scattered manuscripts. But his name remains woven through the memory of Andalusian history, a tragic thread in a magnificent but doomed tapestry. Among historians, al-Mutamid is still praised for his patronage of the arts, for elevating Seville to one of the brightest centers of Muslim culture in Europe. His verses, where they have been preserved, are admired for their depth and their beauty. In them, scholars find a man of immense sensitivity, gifted with language and music, aware of the fleetingness of human joys. Yet, his tragic end can never be separated from that legacy. In his final desperate act, drinking mercury to cheat death, al-Mutamid became a cautionary tale. His story reminds us of the dangers of blind faith in untested remedies, of trusting those who promise miracles without proof, of letting fear drive us to self-destruction. Even in the context of his age, where alchemy was respected as a branch of philosophy, his experiment stands out as reckless. Al-Mutamid was no mere victim of circumstance. His choices, his unwillingness to accept the limits of age, his decision to place complete trust in unproven medicine, sealed his fate. In that sense, his downfall is timeless. Throughout history, powerful men and women have been seduced by the dream of immortality. They have tried to command youth and life itself, as though these were prizes to be taken by force. Al-Mutamid's failure echoes the same warning heard in the stories of emperors, pharaohs, and modern tycoons. No human power can defy the laws of nature without consequence. Seville, after its loss, would rise again centuries later under Christian rule. Its monuments, its grand gardens, and its minarets, converted to bell towers, became part of a new narrative. But hidden behind these layers of conquest and transformation, the story of al-Mutamid still lingers. For some, he is remembered as a martyr to his own hopes; for others, a tragic fool. In modern Seville, occasional references still surface to the poet king who drank poison in search of youth. His name adorns schools, streets, and historical plaques. Scholars still debate how much of his legend is fact, how much is myth, and how much has been colored by later chroniclers eager to moralize his story. Yet, however one judges him, al-Mutamid's life and death command respect, and caution. They remind us that no amount of brilliance, poetry, or courage can save those who abandon reason in the face of fear. His legacy, then, is twofold: the breathtaking achievements of his cultural renaissance and the bitter lesson of his final days. As the sun sets over the Guadalquivir today, its waters flowing as they did 1,000 years ago, one can still sense the ghosts of Al-Mutamid's court, the poets reciting under orange trees, the soldiers polishing their swords, the scholars debating in the cool shade of a marble patio. In their midst, a sultan stands, tall and proud, unwilling to grow old. In his hand, a cup glints with the silvery shimmer of mercury, the false promise of eternity. Elagabalus, death after the 3-day orgy. History remembers some emperors for their military brilliance, others for their reforms, their diplomacy, or their tyranny. Yet, there exists a rarer category: those whose infamy outlives both their achievements and failures, carried through time not by victories or reforms, but by the shockwaves they sent through their civilization. Among this category, one figure commands singular attention: Elagabalus. His reign was brief, just 4 years, but in that time, he ignited a firestorm of reaction and myth that would persist for nearly 2 millennia. Installed on the throne at barely 14 years of age, Elagabalus did not tread the cautious path of imperial decorum. Instead, he confounded expectations with behavior that broke sharply from Roman tradition, whether in matters of faith, fashion, governance, or identity. To the senators and generals of Rome, he was a bewildering figure, a high priest from the East, draped in silks and crowned with divine ambition. He brought with him a foreign god, alien customs, and a manner of rule that to many appeared less like governance and more like performance. His presence disrupted more than just politics; it challenged the very notion of what it meant to be Roman. Reports from ancient historians, many written long after his death, depict an emperor obsessed with ritual and pleasure, who blurred the lines of gender and embraced theatricality in all forms. Banquets of surreal luxury, religious ceremonies of unfamiliar rhythm, marriages that violated sacred taboos. Whether embellished or not, these accounts reflect the collective anxiety of a Roman elite unprepared for such an emperor. By the age of 18, the Roman establishment had had enough. Elagabalus was murdered by his own guards, his mother killed beside him. Their bodies were desecrated, dragged through the streets, and cast into the Tiber. The regime erased his memory from official records, but they could not erase the story. This is the tale of an adolescent ruler who ascended to the world's most powerful position and reigned not with discipline, but with spectacle. A figure both reviled and reimagined, whose life continues to fascinate and divide scholars. A mirror held up to the empire's deepest contradictions. This is the story of Elagabalus, a boy emperor whose reign illuminated the fractures of a vast and weary empire, and whose legacy remains one of history's most provocative enigmas. The year is 218 CE. The Roman Empire spans from the British Isles to the sands of Mesopotamia, from the forests of Germania to the deserts of Africa. It is a colossus, but one that trembles beneath the weight of internal decay. In the decades leading up to this moment, the once stable order has grown volatile. Power has become increasingly tied to the shifting favor of the military. Emperors rise and fall at the whim of legions, and the Senate holds little more than ceremonial influence. The Severan dynasty, founded by the African-born general Septimius Severus, had promised strength through military discipline and central control. But with the assassination of his son Caracalla, himself remembered as a cruel and unpredictable ruler, the empire enters another cycle of instability. The short and fragile reign of Macrinus, Caracalla's successor and former Praetorian prefect, does little to restore faith. Rome is leaderless in spirit, if not in name. Amid this uncertainty, far from Rome in the city of Emesa in Syria, an ambitious woman plots a return to power. Julia Maesa, sister-in-law to Septimius Severus, and grandmother to a 14-year-old boy named Varius Avitus Bassianus, recognizes an opening. She declares that the boy is not merely of noble blood, but the secret son of Caracalla himself, a claim impossible to verify, yet politically powerful. The boy is young, attractive, and carries religious prestige. As high priest of the Syrian sun god Elagabalus, he commands both ceremonial authority and emotional fervor among Eastern troops. His public persona is infused with mysticism. To the Roman elite, his foreign rituals seem alien. But to the legions stationed in Syria, he appears divine. Through careful coordination and large bribes, Julia Maesa wins the loyalty of these Eastern legions. The boy is proclaimed emperor by the soldiers, an act that instantly transforms a provincial priest into a contender for imperial power. His cause is not driven by personal ambition, but by the will and calculation of the women who surround him. His mother, Julia Soamius, and grandmother become the architects of his destiny. The campaign to seize the empire is swift and effective. The forces of Macrinus falter. The decisive battle near Antioch ends in the defeat and death of the sitting emperor. In the eyes of many, divine favor has chosen a new Caesar. Elagabalus, though still known by his birth name, is now the ruler of the Roman world. But Rome itself is not ready for what he brings. The Senate had not sanctioned him. The traditional religious class is wary. The capital braces for the arrival of a boy emperor, steeped in Eastern rites, whose rise has bypassed every Roman institution. A triumphal entry into Rome is prepared. But beneath the fanfare is unease. The elite whisper warnings of heresy and degeneracy. The people, curious and hopeful, look to the new ruler with a mixture of awe and apprehension. They expected an emperor. What they received was a revolution in purple. From the moment Elagabalus set foot in Rome, he made it clear that he would not conform to the imperial mold. His arrival was not that of a traditional emperor, but of a religious icon. Draped in the brightly colored silks and ornate garments of the East, surrounded by chanting priests and bearing the sacred black stone of his god, Elagabalus entered Rome more like a high priest than a Caesar. The deity he brought with him, Elagabalus, a Syrian sun god, was not an addition to the Roman pantheon, but a challenge to it. Elagabalus declared Elagabalus to be the supreme deity of the empire, superior even to Jupiter. He ordered that all gods, Roman and foreign, be subordinated to this Eastern divinity. Statues of Jupiter, Mars, and other traditional gods were brought to the newly constructed Elagabalium on the Palatine Hill to symbolically bow before the black stone. These acts were seen as outrageous by the Roman religious establishment. Elagabalus was not simply embracing a foreign faith, he was overturning Rome's sacred hierarchy. The rituals he instituted were unfamiliar and dramatic: processions of eunuch priests, sacrifices of exotic animals, and ceremonies conducted in languages few in Rome understood. To many Romans, it felt as if the empire itself had been placed in the service of an alien god. The Senate bristled at the changes. The people murmured in confusion. The army, though tolerant of religious variety in the provinces, struggled with a state religion that seemed to strip Rome of its divine protectors. But Elagabalus was not content with religious innovation. His style of rule was equally subversive. Where previous emperors had projected images of discipline, martial strength, or philosophical reserve, Elagabalus offered pageantry. He was known to wear women's makeup and elaborate jewelry. His robes shimmered with gold thread, and his appearances in public became theatrical spectacles. He sometimes rode through the city in chariots pulled not by horses, but by nude women or exotic animals. He blurred the line between private desire and public duty. He appointed close companions and lovers to high-ranking government positions, often without regard to their experience or reputation. His court was said to be filled with dancers, actors, and performers, many of whom wielded more influence than Roman nobles. Lavish banquets became a hallmark of his reign. According to ancient accounts, he served guests food laced with gold and scattered rose petals from ceilings until they smothered the diners. Wine flowed in fountains, and meals were accompanied by music and sensual performances. Some tales even describe rooms with rotating ceilings and tables of mechanical wonders designed to surprise and shock. Roman moralists, especially in the senatorial class, were scandalized. To them, these displays were not just wasteful, they were treasonous, undermining the dignity and seriousness of the imperial office. They interpreted his behavior as symptomatic of a deeper decay within the empire. The ancient sources, particularly Cassius Dio and the Historia Augusta, are rife with such stories, many of which veer into the implausible. Claims that Elagabalus prostituted himself or that he created lotteries where prizes included both gold and torture reflect the Roman tendency to weaponize sexuality and excess when criticizing rulers. It is difficult to disentangle fact from polemic. What is undeniable, however, is that Elagabalus stood in direct opposition to Roman conservatism. His reign was interpreted not just as erratic or irresponsible, but as a full-scale affront to Roman identity. Whether his actions were motivated by genuine religious conviction, personal pleasure, or political defiance, he alienated nearly every power block within the empire. To a society rooted in tradition, hierarchy, and control, Elagabalus embodied disruption. And disruption in imperial Rome was rarely tolerated for long. The most sensational and enduring stories surrounding Elagabalus center not on war or diplomacy, but on his personal life. It was here, in the emperor's private behavior, that Rome perceived its most flagrant threats. According to the historian Dio Cassius, who was both a contemporary and a critic, Elagabalus was not merely eccentric. He was radically defiant of Roman gender and sexual norms. He reportedly married at least 5 times, flaunting a disregard for the sanctity of Roman marriage law. Among his most infamous unions was a marriage to a Vestal virgin, Aquileia Severa, an act that outraged the Roman public. Vestals were sacred figures sworn to 30 years of chastity under penalty of death. For an emperor to wed one was to violate not just law, but deeply rooted religious taboo. Even more scandalous was Elagabalus' relationship with Hierocles, a former slave and charioteer. Not only did Elagabalus elevate Hierocles to positions of influence, he is said to have referred to him as his husband and publicly declared himself the wife, the mistress, and the queen. These terms were shocking in a society where masculinity was closely tied to dominance and active sexual roles. For an emperor, Rome's supreme figure of authority, to embrace what Romans considered the passive feminine role was nothing short of political heresy. Sources also claim that Elagabalus expressed a strong desire to physically transform his body. He is said to have offered physicians vast sums to perform surgeries that would make him more female, an astonishing account that, if accurate, represents one of the earliest recorded expressions of gender dysphoria in history. While modern scholars debate the literal truth of these stories, their presence in the historical record is telling. Elagabalus openly challenged one of the most deeply rooted pillars of Roman identity, its gender hierarchy. These behaviors were not confined to palace walls. Elagabalus blurred the lines between public ritual and private identity. He reportedly cross-dressed in public, wore cosmetics, and referred to himself in feminine terms. His court became a place of lavish performance, where conventional roles were inverted and status was determined not by rank or merit, but by intimacy with the emperor. He reportedly hosted grand processions in which he appeared dressed as various goddesses, even impersonating Venus and Cybele. His body, his appearance, and his public statements became a stage, one on which he acted out a vision of the divine that merged spirituality with personal transformation. To some, this was deeply spiritual. To most Romans, it was incomprehensible. Even his marriages, though numerous, appear to have had a ritual or symbolic element. His union with Aquileia Severa, for instance, was said to represent the joining of 2 cults, the Syrian sun god Elagabal and the Roman goddess Vesta. But this merging of religions through marriage was another affront to tradition, another challenge to the orthodoxy. The historian Herodian adds further detail, describing Elagabalus as effeminate in manner and obsessed with beauty. He reportedly bathed in perfumes, surrounded himself with eunuchs, and dressed in clothes that sparkled with jewels. Some reports even claim that he auctioned nights with himself in the palace, treating his own body as a commodity, scandalizing even those used to imperial eccentricity. Historians debate the truth of these claims. Some argue that they reflect exaggeration, part of a larger effort to justify his assassination. Roman historians were known to discredit emperors they disliked by attributing sexual perversions and effeminacy, especially in cases where the emperor was foreign or unpopular. Yet, the persistence and consistency of these stories across multiple sources suggest that, at minimum, Elagabalus defied expectations in a highly visible and sustained way. To the Roman political class, senators, generals, and magistrates, this was intolerable. The emperor was supposed to be the embodiment of virtus, a word that literally means manliness and implies strength, restraint, and dignity. Elagabalus upended this ideal. He made a mockery of it, perhaps intentionally. In doing so, he alienated himself from every institution that had once supported him. The military grew suspicious. The Senate felt humiliated. The public, uncertain whether to laugh or revolt, grew restless. What is certain is that Elagabalus' private life became his public scandal, and in Rome, the two could not be separated. In his pursuit of personal truth or spectacle, or both, he set himself against the entire weight of Roman tradition, and the empire would not forgive him. The backlash against Elagabalus did not come all at once, but gathered momentum as each institution he had alienated turned away from him. The Praetorian Guard, once swayed by bribes and loyalty to his grandmother, grew uneasy with his conduct. They were Rome's kingmakers, guardians of the emperor, and they expected discipline, predictability, and respect. Elagabalus offered none of these. His disregard for traditional military honors and preference for pageantry made the Guard question his leadership. He replaced seasoned officers with personal favorites, dismissed important commanders, and created instability at the highest levels of the chain of command. Whispers spread in the barracks. The emperor was not just unorthodox. He was unfit. Meanwhile, the Senate, already marginalized by decades of autocratic rule, found itself increasingly sidelined. Elagabalus rarely consulted them, issuing decrees without ceremony or justification. To the senatorial class, this was both a personal insult and a constitutional outrage. Senators who dared to criticize the emperor's policies or court life found themselves dismissed, humiliated, or ignored. Some were exiled, a few simply vanished. The Roman public, too, began to turn. While spectacle had initially drawn curiosity and admiration, the sheer strangeness of Elagabalus's public persona began to grate. Bread and circuses could not mask the growing perception that Rome was being governed by a distant, indulgent priest-king, more interested in religion and ritual than governance and justice. But perhaps most fatally, Elagabalus lost the support of the women who had placed him in power. Julia Maesa, the matriarch of the Severan dynasty, recognized that her influence was waning along with her grandson's credibility. She understood the currents of Roman politics and saw that the empire would not tolerate Elagabalus for much longer. Behind the scenes, she began quietly building support for her other grandson, Severus Alexander. Alexander, a boy of about 13, was everything Elagabalus was not: quiet, obedient, Roman in appearance and attitude. His education was overseen by respected tutors, his behavior praised by senators. Maesa presented him as a return to normalcy, a Severan heir who could calm the chaos. The transition was careful, deliberate. Julia Maesa orchestrated an arrangement whereby both grandsons would be co-rulers, a pretense to ease Elagabalus into irrelevance. But Elagabalus sensed the threat. He attempted to sideline Alexander, reportedly ordering his execution. The Praetorian Guard refused. The refusal was decisive. The Guard no longer saw Elagabalus as emperor. Their loyalty had shifted. In early 222 CE, when Elagabalus entered the Praetorian camp demanding Alexander's death, he sealed his own fate. The guards turned on him, attacking not only the emperor but his mother, Julia Soaemias, as well. It was not a clean execution, it was a brutal assassination. Their bodies were desecrated, dragged through the streets of Rome, stripped of all dignity. The young emperor, who had once proclaimed himself a living god, was thrown into the Tiber River like refuse. No tomb, no ceremony, no honor. The aftermath was swift. The Elagabalium was desecrated and rededicated. Statues and coins bearing Elagabalus' image were melted down or defaced. His name was struck from public inscriptions. Laws he enacted were reversed. Priests of Elagabal were dismissed or punished. His religious reforms, some of which may have been sincerely meant, were undone in days. Most devastating of all was the damnatio memoriae imposed by the Senate. It was a formal erasure, a condemnation of memory. In Rome, this punishment was rare and symbolic. It meant more than forgetting. It meant actively destroying all traces of a person's existence. But erasure is never complete. The more Rome tried to forget, the more it revealed how deeply Elagabalus had disturbed the status quo. His memory survived in rumor, in slander, in fascination. And in every effort to silence his legacy, Rome ensured that the story would persist, cautionary, sensational, and unforgettable. For centuries, Elagabalus endured in popular imagination as the embodiment of imperial decadence. To many later Roman commentators and medieval chroniclers, he was a cautionary tale. The emperor who lost his throne by indulging in extravagance, impiety, and perversion. His name became synonymous with excess, effeminacy, and chaos. The portraits painted by his detractors were vivid and damning. A ruler who mocked Roman religion, insulted its morals, and turned the imperial palace into a stage for personal fantasies. In this retelling, Elagabalus was not merely misguided, he was a threat to civilization itself. Generations of historians repeated and embellished these narratives, reinforcing a legend of monstrosity. But in recent decades, scholarship has taken a different turn. Modern historians, equipped with a critical approach to primary sources and a deeper understanding of historiographical bias, have begun to re-examine Elagabalus with greater nuance. They ask, how much of what we know is the product of later propaganda? How many of the lurid anecdotes about his marriages, banquets, and religious practices reflect truth, and how many were crafted to justify his removal? In the Roman world, where moral character and political legitimacy were tightly intertwined, it was common to destroy a fallen emperor's reputation as part of erasing his legacy. The major sources, Dio Cassius, Herodian, and the Historia Augusta, were all written after Elagabalus's death, sometimes decades later. None of them were impartial. Dio, in particular, had strong senatorial sympathies and viewed Eastern rulers with deep suspicion. His contempt for Elagabalus's foreignness, youth, and gender expression bleeds into every account. The Historia Augusta, an anonymous compilation from a later century, is riddled with fabrications and satirical insertions. Herodian offers slightly more measured commentary, but still reflects a Roman discomfort with Elagabalus's divergence from tradition. Contemporary scholars suggest that many of Elagabalus's reforms may have been sincere attempts at religious transformation. He may have envisioned a monotheistic or syncretic system with Elagabal as a solar deity encompassing other gods. If so, he was not alone. Other emperors, including Aurelian and Constantine, would later promote solar cults or monotheism. In this light, Elagabalus could be seen not as a blasphemer, but a religious innovator whose vision arrived too early for his time. As for his personal conduct, modern interpretations vary. Some suggest he was a flamboyant youth indulging in courtly theater. Others argue that his expression of gender and sexuality, far from merely performative, may have constituted a sincere identity. Ancient accounts that he sought surgical transformation preferred to be addressed in feminine terms, and publicly affirmed same-sex partnerships have led some modern scholars to propose that Elagabalus may have been transgender or non-binary, making him one of the earliest known figures in history to live openly in that way. Yet not all scholars are comfortable with projecting contemporary frameworks onto ancient individuals. They caution that identity in the Roman world did not follow modern categories, and that terms like transgender or non-binary may obscure as much as they reveal. To understand Elagabalus requires both empathy and restraint, an acknowledgement of what we can know and what remains elusive. What is certain is that Elagabalus broke with norms in a way few rulers dared. His story resists easy categorization. Was he a proto-monotheist, a queer icon, an irresponsible adolescent, or a victim of political intrigue? Perhaps he was all of these, and more. His rule lasted only 4 years, but his memory has spanned 20 centuries. In art, literature, and academic debate, Elagabalus endures as a symbol of Rome's anxieties about gender, faith, youth, and power. Painters from the Renaissance to the 20th century have depicted him amid roses and orgies, reinforcing the myth, yet his true motivations and feelings remain locked behind the veil of history. A young priest of a foreign god. A teenager thrust into an empire's highest seat. A figure of scandal and fascination, who challenged the world's most powerful civilization and paid the price. Whatever the truth, Elagabalus remains one of the most enigmatic figures in imperial history. And in that enigma, we see not only the man, but the empire that tried and failed to forget him. Elagabalus's life is a study in contrasts, youth and power, faith and heresy, freedom and collapse. He was a paradox embodied in flesh, at once the master of the known world and a child lost in a palace of ritual, performance, and expectation. His reign, though brief, laid bare the fragility of imperial authority. He did not lead Rome into war or economic ruin, yet his presence alone caused a rupture in the empire's self-image. He reflected Rome's deepest contradictions, its multicultural expanse versus its cultural conservatism, its imperial reach versus its fear of foreign influence, its superficial tolerance versus its rigid hierarchies. By elevating a foreign god to supremacy, Elagabalus forced Rome to question its spiritual foundations. By expressing himself outside of conventional gender roles, he unsettled the foundations of Roman masculinity and authority. His reign exposed the myth of Roman uniformity, showing instead an empire filled with cultural tension, religious competition, and political fragility. He was both a symbol and a symptom of Rome's deeper turmoil. The empire, though vast, was fraying. Its borders stretched beyond its cohesion. Its institutions strained under the weight of ambition and corruption. Its identity challenged by the very diversity it had once embraced as strength. Elagabalus did not destroy Rome. He did not lead armies to defeat or bankrupt the treasury. But his reign forced Rome to confront questions it was not ready to answer, about the limits of cultural assimilation, the nature of imperial legitimacy, the role of personal identity in public power, and whether the empire could ever reconcile its tradition with transformation. In that sense, Elagabalus remains a mirror, reflecting both the fears of ancient Rome and the unresolved questions of our own age. He challenges us to consider what happens when institutions meet the unfamiliar, when tradition encounters transformation, when power is held by someone who refuses to conform. Was he mad? Was he misunderstood? Was he dangerous? Or was he merely too different, too early, too symbolic of the changes that frightened those around him? Perhaps all or none. Or perhaps he simply dared to live a truth too bold for the world that crowned him. What we know for certain is this: he ruled, he fell, and he was never forgotten. His memory, tarnished and twisted, still endures, not as a lesson easily defined, but as a challenge to how history is told and who is allowed to shape it. Peter of Castile, a lover's execution. History is not short of brutal kings. It has seen despots, usurpers, mad tyrants, and cold tacticians. But among the cruelest monarchs of medieval Europe, few inspire the same mixture of horror and fascination as Peter I of Castile. He wasn't a warlord from the fringes of civilization. He was a legitimate Christian monarch, ruling a powerful kingdom in what is today Spain. He is remembered not for grand reforms or glorious conquests, but for acts of savagery that stunned even his contemporaries. One incident in particular has echoed through time, a moment of vengeance so grotesque it borders on the unbelievable. According to historical accounts, Peter learned that his estranged queen had taken a lover. Instead of confronting her, he had the man executed in secret, cooked his flesh, and served it to the queen for dinner. Only after the meal did he reveal what she had eaten. Whether fully true or embellished, the episode became a symbol of his reign, one ruled by cruelty, paranoia, and absolute control. Yet it is not merely the act itself that made history gasp, but the context in which it occurred, the cultural, diplomatic, and psychological weight it carried. Chroniclers such as Pero López de Ayala, who served the Trastámara dynasty that supplanted Peter, wrote of the incident in tones of horror and condemnation, using it as a moral cautionary tale against tyranny. Foreign ambassadors reported rumors of the event with a mixture of revulsion and awe, reinforcing Peter's growing reputation in European courts as a man capable of almost theatrical monstrosity. In England and France, kingdoms deeply entangled in the Hundred Years' War, Peter's tale became a political football. To the French, the humiliation and alleged poisoning of Blanche, their kin, was a scandal that demanded retribution. The English, who would later support Peter for their own strategic gain, cautiously distanced themselves from the most grotesque aspects of his legend, even while recognizing his potential as a pawn against French interests. The story rippled far beyond Castile. In the Italian city-states, where Renaissance humanism was beginning to bud, diplomats recorded the affair in coded reports. In Avignon, where the papacy resided, the episode was cited in complaints against Peter's treatment of church allies. The story was retold in monastic chronicles, dramatized in allegorical texts, and in some cases used as a symbolic reference to the consequences of unrepentant sin. In the centuries that followed, this infamous dinner became more than history. It became lore, fused into the cultural memory of Spain and Europe. Plays, ballads, and moral treatises would use it as shorthand for unchecked royal power. Whether or not the dinner took place exactly as described, its emotional truth, that a king could feed death to his queen with cold deliberation, was too compelling to be dismissed. But who was Peter the Cruel? What made a man, a monarch, choose such a horrifying path to vengeance? And how did this one gruesome meal become a metaphor for an entire reign? Peter was born on September 30th, 1334, in the city of Burgos, the de facto capital of Castile. He was the only legitimate son of King Alfonso XI and Queen Maria of Portugal. Yet from the moment of his birth, his claim to the throne was overshadowed by a deeply entrenched and toxic dynamic in the royal family. For over 2 decades, Alfonso XI openly favored his mistress, Leonor de Guzman, a powerful noblewoman, over his lawful wife. Leonor bore him 10 children, many of whom were granted lands, titles, and positions of influence during Alfonso's reign. This dynastic rivalry planted the seeds of civil war even before Peter ever touched a crown. The royal court was bitterly divided between supporters of the queen and those loyal to Leonor's children, particularly the eldest, Enrique of Trastámara. This division was not just personal. It shaped policy, appointments, and power dynamics throughout the realm. Factionalism became institutionalized. When Alfonso died in 1350, a sudden victim of the Black Death while laying siege to Gibraltar, the throne passed to the 16-year-old Peter. Immediately, the fragile balance shattered. Queen Maria, long humiliated and marginalized, struck swiftly. She had Leonor arrested and executed without trial. This act enraged Leonor's children and their powerful noble backers. From that moment, Peter's reign would be contested not just politically, but emotionally, rooted in revenge and dynastic vengeance. The Castile Peter inherited was not a unified or prosperous realm. The Black Death had ravaged towns and villages, killing between 30% and 50% of the population in some regions. Agricultural collapse, inflation, and labor shortages crippled the economy. The social order was fraying, and traditional feudal bonds between lords and vassals were breaking under the pressure of survival. To make matters worse, Castile faced external pressures on nearly every border. To the east lay the Crown of Aragon, a rival maritime power with competing interests in the Mediterranean. To the south remained the Emirate of Granada, a Muslim stronghold still resisting the Christian Reconquista. To the north, Navarre and France had their own designs, and within, powerful noble families such as the Lara, Haro, and Trastamara clans formed shifting alliances to assert dominance. Peter understood that survival depended on centralizing power. From the outset, he pursued reforms that would strengthen the monarchy at the expense of the nobility. He sought to increase royal revenues, reduce corruption in municipal governments, and expand the administrative bureaucracy. Many of his appointments favored individuals of lower noble rank, professional administrators, or members of minority communities, especially Jews who had long served as royal financiers and scribes. This pragmatic policy won him capable servants, but earned him deep resentment from the traditional aristocracy and the church. His Jewish allies were vilified as symbols of his illegitimacy. Propaganda spread portraying Peter as a heretic, a tyrant, and a danger to Christian order. Rumors circulated that he practiced sorcery, consorted with demons, or planned to convert to Judaism. Meanwhile, Peter's personal traits fed into these anxieties. He was brilliant but mercurial, passionate but unforgiving. Known to shift from generosity to wrath with little warning, he inspired both admiration and terror. His court became a place of constant suspicion. Espionage, betrayal, and assassination were regular tools of governance. Yet it must be said, Peter was not entirely without principle. He genuinely sought to bring justice to the realm, often intervening in disputes between peasants and lords in favor of the former. He took steps to curb the excesses of feudal privilege, and in matters of law, he supported reforms that limited arbitrary confiscation of property. But the more he pushed for order, the more chaotic things became. Every reform birthed a new enemy. Every execution made another family into rebels. Peter's reign was a pressure cooker, and the kingdom's nobility, clergy, and foreign rivals were all waiting for it to explode. In a bid to secure foreign support and bolster legitimacy, Peter entered into a marriage alliance with France. He was wed by proxy to Blanche of Bourbon, a cousin of King John II of France. The alliance was orchestrated by Peter's advisors in the French court, who hoped that the union would stabilize Castile and cement French influence on the Iberian Peninsula. Blanche was young, only 16 years old, and came from one of France's most prestigious houses. The marriage was celebrated in Burgos, but something was wrong from the very beginning. Peter refused to consummate the marriage. The king appeared distracted, even dismissive during the ceremonies. He left shortly after the wedding and did not return. Peter's heart already belonged to another, Maria de Padilla, a young Castilian noblewoman of great charm and intellect. Peter and Maria had been lovers long before his political marriage, and he never truly abandoned her. Some sources even claim that Peter had secretly married Maria in 1352, a year before his wedding to Blanche, although no contemporary records conclusively prove this. When Blanche arrived in Castile in 1353, she was met not with celebration, but suspicion. Within days of their official wedding ceremony, Peter left her behind, returning to Maria. He accused Blanche of engaging in conspiracies with the nobles and of attempting to betray him, claims that were never substantiated, and which appear to have been politically convenient rather than grounded in fact. Peter then ordered that Blanche be placed under guard. Her status became increasingly ambiguous, nominally a queen, but in practice a prisoner. She was confined to various castles in northern Castile, including Medina, Sidonia, and Sigüenza. She had no court, no freedom of movement, and no contact with her homeland. The French court protested vehemently. Blanche's father, Peter I, Duke of Bourbon, was enraged. He demanded justice for his daughter and compensation for the perceived insult to his house. King John II of France sent envoys to Castile, appealing to the Pope to intercede. Pope Innocent VI issued a directive demanding Peter honor the marriage, but the Castilian king ignored it. The scandal strained relations with France and made Peter a pariah in some diplomatic circles, but it also emboldened him. From that point forward, he ruled less as a consensus builder and more as an authoritarian, dismissing foreign pressure as interference in his domestic affairs. At the same time, internal purges intensified. Nobles connected to the Bourbon family were arrested or executed. Peter's paranoia deepened, and his court became a place of whispered accusations and swift retribution. Lands were seized, titles revoked. Those who dared express sympathy for Blanche risked losing everything. And Maria de Padilla's influence over Peter grew stronger. She was more than a mistress. She was his advisor, confidant, and political ally. She bore him 4 children, Beatrice, Constance, Isabella, and Alfonso. Peter would later attempt to legitimize them, naming Constance as a potential successor and arranging her marriage to John of Gaunt, son of King Edward III of England. These acts further complicated Peter's political web, intertwining his family with English dynastic ambitions. But while Maria thrived at court, Blanche languished in captivity. Her letters to the Pope and French nobles paint a bleak picture of isolation, illness, and fear. She was denied medical care, her food was restricted, she was allowed no visitors except for guards. In such conditions, rumors were inevitable. Stories began to circulate that Blanche had found solace in the arms of a guard, a servant, or a fellow noble in exile. Some versions suggest romantic affection. Others claim coercion or survival-driven complicity. No definitive proof exists, but the mere suggestion of infidelity, however implausible, was enough to ignite Peter's fury. Whether Peter truly believed the rumors or used them as a pretext for vengeance remains debated. But what followed would become one of the most infamous episodes in royal history, and one of the darkest intersections of love, power, and cruelty ever recorded. The details of what happened next vary from source to source. Medieval chroniclers, writing decades later and often with political agendas, differ in the names and specifics, but the core narrative remains. Peter, upon hearing of Blanche's supposed affair, responded not with a trial, but with execution. The man, whether a noble named Fadrique or a lowly servant, was seized and imprisoned. Some sources suggest torture, others simply state that he disappeared into the bowels of the castle. What is agreed upon is this: Peter ordered that the man be killed, his body dismembered, and the flesh cooked. In the kitchens of the royal fortress, likely Medina Sidonia or Arevalo, chefs were given unholy instructions. The body was rendered into meat, prepared with sauces and spices. The flesh, indistinguishable from traditional game or mutton, was plated and presented. Contemporary descriptions, though often colored by political motivations, speak of the methodical nature of this act. Peter was not content with the mere elimination of a rival. He wanted his vengeance to penetrate the emotional and psychological realm. This was not execution. It was a message. It was theater. The preparation of the meal itself is recounted in some texts with unsettling precision. According to one version, Peter supervised the early stages of the punishment, ensuring the act was carried out in total secrecy with only the most trusted kitchen staff involved. The meat was marinated to disguise any peculiarities in texture. The bones were burned or buried, leaving no evidence. That evening, Blanche dined. Alone in a room cold with suspicion, she was served what she believed to be a royal delicacy. Isolated, humiliated, perhaps emotionally numb, she partook of the meal. Accounts suggest she found the food peculiar, but tasty. She asked no questions. Only after she had eaten did Peter arrive. He informed her, with calculated coldness, that the man she had loved, or was merely rumored to have loved, was now inside her. That her betrayal had been punished, and she had become part of it. This story, circulated by Peter's enemies, and later reinforced by the Trastamara dynasty, became legend. Chroniclers seized on its horror. Ayala, who served the victorious Trastamaras, wrote that this episode illustrated Peter's madness and cruelty, that no woman, even a queen, was safe from his sadism. Foreign diplomats referenced the dinner in private correspondence as an example of the depravity gripping the Castilian crown. There is no record of Blanche's immediate reaction, only silence. And then, in the years that followed, her health declined. She died in 1361, possibly poisoned, possibly by illness, still a prisoner. She was buried without ceremony. Later chroniclers embellished the tale. Some claimed Peter laughed as he delivered the news. Others suggested Blanche attempted to starve herself afterward. A few even speculated that the story was allegorical, a metaphor invented to represent Peter's total domination over his queen. Modern historians remain divided. Some interpret the story as a grim example of political myth-making, a propaganda tool used to dehumanize Peter after his death. Others argue that the king's documented behavior elsewhere supports the plausibility of the event. He was, after all, a man known for burning prisoners alive, executing entire noble families, and ordering assassinations without remorse. But whether literal or symbolic, the dinner captured something essential about Peter's rule. The deliberate fusion of personal betrayal and statecraft, the transformation of vengeance into spectacle. For Peter, justice was not just served, it was plated, seasoned, and consumed. It is likely that this event, or its perception, accelerated Peter's fall. The European courts, already uneasy with his treatment of Blanche, were now convinced of his unfitness. The incident became a rallying cry for his enemies, both within and outside Castile. This wasn't just a crime. It was a legend. And legends have a way of outliving kings. The murder of Blanche's alleged lover and the grotesque dinner further alienated Peter from the European courts. France, outraged, began supporting Enrique of Trastamara's claim to the throne. The Pope, though cautious, leaned toward the rebels. Papal legates wrote that Peter's crimes were unfit for a Christian monarch and that he had desecrated the image of holy kingship. Peter's excommunication was considered more than symbolic. It gave moral cover to rebellion. Within Castile, the kingdom was unraveling. Nobles, once loyal, now feared for their lives. Others saw an opportunity to overthrow the king and reclaim autonomy. The aristocracy, already uneasy with Peter's centralization policies, now viewed Enrique as a vehicle to restore their influence. Even cities that had once benefited from Peter's reforms began to distance themselves, wary of the looming chaos. In 1366, Enrique invaded Castile from the north with the support of France and Aragon. His forces were bolstered by the mercenary companies, notorious soldiers of fortune displaced by the temporary lull in the 100 Years' War. Led by the feared Bertrand du Guesclin, these professional killers ravaged the countryside as they marched. Peter was caught unprepared. He fled south with what remained of his loyal guard, seeking support from England. His appeals reached the court of Edward, the Black Prince of Wales, who had command over Aquitaine. The English crown, eager to counter French expansion and gain a foothold in Iberia, agreed to assist. In 1367, Edward led a combined Anglo-Castilian force into Spain. The ensuing Battle of Navarre was a spectacular victory for Peter. Enrique's forces were routed, and he barely escaped with his life. Peter, triumphant, returned to the throne. But the cost was steep. The English demanded repayment for their aid, gold, grain, and strategic concessions. Peter could not deliver. His treasury was empty. Castile, bled by war, famine, and corruption, was in no position to pay. Edward returned to England, disillusioned and ill. English support evaporated. Peter's paranoia deepened. He turned on former allies, accusing them of collusion with Enrique. Executions resumed. Cities rebelled. Loyalist governors defected. By 1368, Enrique had regrouped, this time with even broader support from France and the Aragonese crown. His second invasion met little resistance. As Enrique advanced, Peter's realm collapsed town by town. Burgos, Valladolid, Toledo, cities that had once declared loyalty now opened their gates to the usurper. The nobility either fled or changed sides. The church, too, largely abandoned Peter, casting him as an unredeemable sinner. In March 1369, Peter made his final stand in the fortress of Montiel. Surrounded, he attempted secret negotiations with Du Guesclin, offering bribes and promises. Du Guesclin pretended to cooperate and betrayed him. Peter was captured and brought to Enrique. The meeting between the two brothers was dramatic. According to chronicler Jean Froissart, Peter rushed Enrique with a dagger, attempting to kill him. The two men wrestled in the flickering torchlight. Du Guesclin allegedly stood back and said, "I don't kill kings," before letting Enrique finish the deed. With a knife to his throat, Peter the Cruel was stabbed in the heart by his own blood. His corpse was displayed for days before being hastily buried. Enrique was crowned King of Castile shortly thereafter. His reign would mark the beginning of the Trastamara dynasty, a line that would unify Spain, sponsor Columbus, and reshape Europe. But Peter's ghost lingered. For years, rumors circulated that he had survived and escaped. Impostors appeared across Europe claiming to be the true king of Castile. Rebellions briefly flared, but none succeeded. The age of Peter was over, but the legend had only just begun. With Peter's death, the Trastamara dynasty began a new chapter in Spanish history. They worked diligently to rewrite Peter's legacy, painting him as a monster. The dinner story, whether true or not, was repeated, exaggerated, and immortalized. From royal charters to ecclesiastical sermons, Peter became the cautionary tale of unrestrained monarchy. Yet history is never so simple. Jewish communities in Castile remembered Peter as a protector. He had resisted anti-Semitic mobs and refused to adopt policies that would segregate or persecute Jews, a stance that infuriated the church and many nobles. He granted them legal protections and reaffirmed their right to live and work freely in Castilian cities. For this, Jewish chroniclers referred to him as El Justiciero, the Just One. Peter's efforts to modernize Castile's administration also left their mark. He strengthened the authority of the crown by reducing the power of hereditary noble offices. He promoted the use of written contracts and legal codification. His chancery produced more documents than any Castilian monarch before him, and his court became a center for legal innovation and multilingual administration. Still, these reforms came at a price. His adversaries interpreted his policies as attacks on tradition. His favoritism toward minorities, lower nobles, and professional bureaucrats isolated him from the elite. His aggressive tactics ensured that the moment his power waned, there would be no one left to defend him. After Peter's death, the Trastamaras not only took his throne but his historical narrative. Chroniclers like Pero López de Ayala reshaped public memory. They compiled detailed accounts of Peter's supposed cruelties, some factual, others invented, to justify Enrique's rise and sanctify his rule. Foreign commentators, too, absorbed this version of Peter. In Italy, he was invoked in comparisons with tyrants from antiquity. In England, his alliances were remembered with ambivalence, overshadowed by the disturbing tales of his domestic conduct. In France, he remained the king who betrayed a Bourbon princess, dishonored his vow, and committed crimes unworthy of Christendom. Yet revisionist waves would occasionally resurface. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Spanish historians re-examined Peter's rule with fresh eyes. They saw a monarch who, despite his faults, had sought to create a stronger, more centralized Castile. His judicial interventions, his protection of urban rights, and his resistance to papal overreach were reevaluated as part of a broader movement toward state building. To some, Peter the Cruel became Peter the Lawgiver. To others, he remained a tyrant, but almost all agreed. He was a ruler of extraordinary complexity, shaped as much by the violent world around him as by any inner darkness. And yet, despite all nuance, the legend of the dinner persists. It is retold in plays, novels, documentaries. It fascinates because it combines the primal with the political, the idea that love, vengeance, and power can intersect at a dinner table with horrifying consequences. Whether the story was real, metaphor, or myth, it endures because it speaks to something timeless, the fear that those in power may someday turn their appetites toward us. And we won't realize it until it's too late. Peter of Castile, Peter the Cruel, has been judged by history as a tyrant, but beneath the cruelty lies a story of a ruler caught between chaos and ambition. He inherited a broken kingdom and sought to control it. He fought powerful nobles, foreign powers, and betrayal from within. But in choosing fear over trust, terror over diplomacy, Peter sowed the seeds of his own destruction. His life ended in blood, but his legacy lives on, not in monuments, not in reforms, but in a single, horrifying story. A story of dinner, of revenge, of a queen who ate her lover. True or not, it defines him. And perhaps that is the final cruelty, to be remembered not for your victories or visions, but for the moment you fed vengeance with silverware. Yet Peter's legacy, gruesome as it may be, is also a mirror. A mirror for the state, for the nature of monarchy, and for us. It raises enduring questions about the limits of power. How far can a ruler go before becoming monstrous? When does justice cross the line into spectacle? And what happens when the state becomes indistinguishable from the sovereign's personal vendettas? In an age where history often blurs with myth, Peter's story persists because it dramatizes timeless fears, that leaders may lose their humanity, that personal betrayal may shape national destiny, and that cruelty, once institutionalized, becomes not a scandal but a system. Modern leaders are rarely served their enemies for supper, but the metaphor still resonates. When power is unchecked, when paranoia rules, and when propaganda replaces principle, we edge closer to Peter's world, a court ruled by vengeance and a kingdom that dines on silence. So what remains of Peter the Cruel? Perhaps only this, a cautionary tale that continues to disturb. Centuries later, a man consumed by suspicion, by power, and ultimately by his own legend, a man whose name outlived his reign, not in admiration, but in warning. He tried to rule by fear. In the end, he was devoured by it.